Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Raimundo Rios Mayo Library in Arkansas. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the show. Tonight we're going to have a special guest, Mr. Nick Redfern. He's a writer, traveler, investigator, and journalist, not to mention monster hunter. He's been on Monster Quest, UFO Hunters, and Ancient Aliens. Born in 1964 in Pelsall, Walsall, Staffordshire, England, he's written or co-authored 72 books. Is that about right, sir?
Oh, no, it's about 30-something.
Well, co-authored.
I guess that's the internet, though, for you.
Well,
yeah, it's roughly half that amount.
I see. Well, I did see your name on a lot of books that I was scanning through in Amazon.
Oh, well, yeah, actually, it sometimes gets a bit confusing because often what happens is Amazon will, if you go to some of the pages, you'll see my book listed as an author or co-author, when in actual fact I've sort of written the foreword or the introduction. I think there's actually about 15 books on Amazon that I've written the intro or the foreword for, but at one point, sort of more than half of those had me listed as like co-author, so it does get a little bit confusing.
Ah, yes. How do you like living here in Texas now?
Oh, I like it. I've been here about 16 years, something like that.
Did they?
Yeah, I lived down by Houston for about the first 4 years I was here. A little town called Nederland, just outside Beaumont. And then for the last 12 years, I've lived in the Dallas area.
When you go back to England, do people tell you you have an odd accent?
They don't sort of say an odd one. They just say that that it sounds slightly different. It still sounds English, I think, but it sounds not my original accent. So. Which I guess after 16 years, it would change.
Oh, yes. How did you get started writing?
Oh, well, when I finished school, it was one of those lucky occasions, that sometimes happens. I wasn't the best student at school. I was, to put that diplomatically and mildly, I was not good at school. And I didn't sort of get much in the way of academic qualifications, no college, no university. And to cut a long story short, I walked out of school one day and never went back. And I didn't know what I was going to do. And it just so happened that the local town I was living in at the time, when I was looking for work, there was an advertisement for a magazine starting up in the area that I was living called Zero. And it was going to be sort of like a typical sort of city what's-on guide, as to everything that's going on, restaurants and bands and clubs and cinema, all that kind of thing in the area for the week ahead or 2 weeks ahead. And they were looking for people straight out of school who would be sort of taught the basics from the bottom upwards. And I thought, well, that kind of sounds cool. And I went along and, I've always enjoyed reading and writing, as I said, even though I wasn't particularly good at school. And they said, well, if you like books and reading and whatever, we'll take a chance on you. And so they taught me basic journalism from, the ground up. And I did that for a couple of years. And that sort of gave me a background in writing and journalism. And then I just decided to go freelance and approached, magazines and newspapers, that kind of thing. And then sort of went full-time writing when I was about in my early 30s, something like that.
That is amazing. So you had no formal journalism training whatsoever?
I had no formal educational background either, never mind just in journalism. For me and my mates at school, school was just for having a good time, But, look, with hindsight, looking back, it's always good to have an academic background. But, it wasn't for,
Yes.
I wasn't lazy. I just wasn't interested in algebra or the rainfall level in Guyana or somewhere. What good was it going to do me after school?
Yes, I know what you mean.
Not. So, I was more interested in, the sort of things that I'd actually need to know when I left school. Sort of just the day-to-day things of living a life. So yeah, but in England, back then, well, they still have a version of it today. They're what was called the Youth Opportunities Program. What it was where companies would be paid 50% of the income by the government of the teenage boy or girl they were going to employ. So in other words, the job that I got, the government paid 50% of my weekly income, and the company only had to pay 50% of it. And they got other benefits as well to train people, straight out of school in one particular profession. So it actually benefited the company to do it,
Mm-hmm.
And it was quite a successful program. That was sort of what I went on. But no, I had no sort of formal, journalism degree or anything like that at all. It was just a case of, we'll take a chance on you and we'll teach you all how to be a journalist and to write and everything else. And that's what happened, really.
Well, you've done quite successful at it. How many different
Well, thank you.
How many different countries have you gone to on your endeavors of investigating different things?
Well, quite a few. Obviously living in the UK, travelling around Europe is easy. So, I did a lot in various countries in Europe, like Switzerland, France, Holland, and of course in the UK, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, and England. But also, I've done investigation in Canada, obviously the US, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, a few other places. So, yeah, it's quite a few. Anywhere where there's sort of something that interests me that I can sort of, investigate and sort of hopefully try and figure out what's going on. So.
In your latest book, The Men in Black, you say you first became interested in the Men in Black when you were about 11?
Yeah, well, what happened was I got interested in the UFO subject round about that age, not because I'd had a personal encounter, but because my dad was in the British Royal Air Force. He worked as a radar mechanic, and he was involved in several UFO incidents in the 50s where the radar operators, over the course of 3 nights, tracked these weird objects approaching the British coastline from the vicinity of Scandinavia. And because it was still the height of the Cold War, the first thought was, well, it's got to be the Russians, even though these objects were performing all sorts of weird maneuvers. And as I said, it went on for 3 nights, and jet fighters were scrambled to intercept them. Pilots couldn't get close to them. Some of them reported seeing disc-like objects. Others reported sort of blinding white lights, but which seemed to be under intelligent control. And my dad, as a radar mechanic, was brought in to make sure the radar equipment wasn't sort of making or interpreting false readings. Mm-hmm. And when it came clear that, something was flying around, everybody was told, you won't talk about this. And my dad didn't say anything until years later, when I was about 12 or 13, 11, 12, something like that anyway. And he told me the story, and that's what got me interested. And then I started, as you said, around about 11, thereabouts, reading books. I think one of the first books I read was John Keel's The Mothman Prophecies, which contains quite a bit of Men in Black material, and J. Allen Hynek's early books, and a lot of the books from the 50s, like Kehoe, which I was able to sort of, by the time I was into this subject, that was like 25, almost 30 years later, sort of the early 80s, and so at that point, I was able to buy up a ton of cheap old sort of 50s paperbacks and whatever. And but I've always found the Men in Black mystery fascinating because, unlike the movie versions, which everybody knows about, Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, the real Men in Black are sort of like ultra creepy and weird. They're nothing like, they're not from the government. They're sort of 5 feet tall, pale, skinny, bulging eyes that they hide behind these big sunglasses, and they almost look like, as some people believe, like an alien-human hybrid.
Wow. We're going to take a real quick break here just for a couple minutes, run some commercials, and we'll be right back with Nick Redfern in just a moment. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. If you're looking for a good cup of coffee, remember, the Organic Man Coffee Shop will soon be opening at their new location, 1002 Iturbide, Suite number 7. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And we're back. We're speaking with Nick Redfern, the author of Men in Black. Tell me, Nick, why do you think Bender changed his direction suddenly from looking into Men in Black to looking into composers?
Well, that's a good point. Albert Bender was the guy who sort of really kicked off the entire Men in Black mystery in the early 50s. He lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and he lived in this old house that kind of looked like Norman Bates' mom's house in Psycho, like some creepy old house. And of all places possible, he lived in the attic. And Bender was someone who, like a lot of sort of young people in the late 40s, early 50s, got really interested in the UFO subject, which really kind of kicked off in 47. And in 51, Bender created this group called the International Flying Saucer Bureau, the IFSB, and put out a newsletter, which he would sort of type and, from his attic room and have copies made and mail it out all across the world. He actually got a lot of interesting coverage, and he was selling it, by the thousands, literally. And this went on for a couple of years to the point where, everything was going well, and then suddenly he closed down the IFSB and quit the subject completely and went on to run the Max Steiner Appreciation Society. Max Steiner, who did the musical score for many movies, including the original King Kong. And he just walked away from ufology, and he confided in a good friend of his, Gray Barker, who wrote a number of UFO books over the years. He confided in Barker that these three guys in black had visited him or threatened him and warned him. But he didn't say much more than that. And Barker wrote a book about it called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers in 56. Now, because Barker hadn't been told much by Keel, he assumed that the Men in Black were from the government, and so he presented them in that book in that fashion.
Mm-hmm.
But after that, Bender decided to come out of semi-retirement, if you like, or complete retirement for a while, to write a book called Flying Saucers and the Three Men, which was published in 62. And in that book, Bender's own book, he said, no, they weren't like government people. He said he would be in his attic room and he would feel sick and lightheaded, and the room would be overwhelmed by this odor of like brimstone or sulfur. And these shadowy figures, almost like the shadow people that people talk about today, kind of manifested in the room. And it was almost like a psychic, telepathic warning or threat, if you like, in his mind. And this went on and on for weeks, and he both his physical and psychological health suffered. And he was basically a case of enough's enough. But a lot of people don't realize that Bender was heavily into the world of the occult. And in his, of course it depends if people believe in this kind of stuff or not, but he constructed what he called a paranormal altar to try and summon up supernatural entities in his bedroom.
Yikes.
And maybe that succeeded because he literally had these shadowy, fedora-wearing black figures appear in his attic. And as I said, his health suffered. He got in a panic and totally freaked out and quit the whole subject. And after just coming back in 1962, that was his only sort of return to the subject, and he stayed away from it till 1962, until his death just 2 months ago.
Man, that doesn't sound like a very pleasant way to spend your time. So
No, and the problem is, like a lot of people who sometimes find themselves plunged into that state, he became very obsessed by it, and he had no life outside of it. And and I always tell people, when you're dealing with subjects like these, it's vital to retain not just a foothold, but a significant portion of your life in the regular world as well. But for Bender, everything revolved around the Men in Black and, this sort of negative thing that got its grips into him. And I think that probably had a bearing on it. There's only sort of so much of that kind of stuff you can take, I'm sure.
Yes. You've written several other books about the Men in Black. You had Covert Agenda, On the Trail of the Saucer Spies, and then The Real Men in Black, not to confuse with the current book that you've got. What is the difference between The Real Men in Black and your current book?
Well, The Real Men in Black is sort of like a historical look at the subject, right from the very early years of Bender to the present day. So, in other words, it sort of focuses on, as I said, the history of it and the different theories for who or what the Men in Black might be. And so it covers everything from classic cases, new and previously unseen cases, and theories that range from sort of government agents, demonic entities, time travelers, alien human hybrids. There's sort of chapters on all the different theories. But whereas the new book, Men in Black, that is basically a collection of all the stories that have reached me since the Real Men in Black book came out. It's like if you're an author on any aspect of the paranormal, people tend to write to you if they've had their experiences in that field. So somebody's an expert in, I know, Area 51, people who write books on it, I'm sure they get a ton of letters and emails from people who, worked there or knew something about it. And it's kind of like that with the Men in Black. I get a lot of emails and Facebook messages from people who've read the earlier books I did and want to share their stories. So the new book, Men in Black, which subtitled Personal Stories and Eerie Adventures, is an extensive, about 300-page collection of all the cases that have come in since, as I said, the Real Men in Black came out. And there's about, I think, 40 or so personal reports and stories from people giving their opinions on the Men in Black. And I introduce each person and, provide a commentary about them and an introduction as well. So it's sort of, like letting the witnesses present their stories in their own words.
In the book you're talking about Brad Steiger. He is also a UFO investigator, where I believe he said he picked up the telephone and he could hear two people talking back and forth.
Yeah, actually, Brad had more than a few encounters and run-ins with Men in Black characters over the years. For example, strange phone calls, Men in Black type characters who almost seemed to be mimicking him, almost like doppelgangers. People thought they saw him in places where he actually wasn't. And that got really creepy, and friends of his got followed. One guy, classic story that he told me, which I included in The Real Men in Black, how a friend of Brad's was visiting London for a few weeks, or a couple of weeks, in the mid-'60s, and he got followed by this sort of trio of these weird, skinny Men in Black, and they looked they didn't actually sort of look properly human. And one of them came up to him at one point and said, "You're a friend of Brad Steiger." He sort of said it more of a statement than a question. And the guy felt very intimidated and said, "Well, yes." And the one said, "Tell him we will visit him at Christmas time." And then they just turned and wandered off into the darkness. So it was a very sinister kind of story, and Brad's got a lot of accounts like that, where it's sort of a perfect example of when you go looking for the Men in Black as a researcher, sometimes, somehow, they know about it, and then they turn the tables on you.
He also mentioned where he was supposed to have had a debate with Carl Sagan that he had never participated in.
Yeah, that's one of the perfect examples of where, I mentioned about how Brad almost seemed to have had this sort of Man in Black style doppelganger mimicking him. And Brad told me how, he'd spoken to people who swore they saw Brad and Sagan having this debate, and it actually did not happen. It's not the case that Brad forgot about it. It simply didn't happen. So that gets very weird, but that's not the first time things like that have happened. John Keel, when he was investigating the Mothman and Men in Black sightings in Point Pleasant in the 60s, he talked about how people would get phone calls and it sounded just like John Keel on the phone. And then it turned out afterwards, the person who they assumed was Keel was asking for information, and because they knew who he was, they were sharing it. And then it turns out that Keel had never, when he did meet the people, when he actually went to town to interview the witnesses, they were like, well, we've already told you the story. And then he realised this was a pattern that was being repeated, that somebody had been able to mimic his voice and his character and everything, to the point where people really thought they were speaking with Keel, and it wasn't him. So.
That could definitely mess up your life if someone is going around pretending to be you, especially if you're a public figure.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why people like Bender suffered so badly, because they get plunged into such states of paranoia. And I think that's one of the things, more than any other, with the Men in Black mystery, that the Men in Black are extremely good at doing, and that's plunging people into states of paranoia. Bender found himself frightened to go out at night. He was a big fan of going to the cinema on a weekend, and a couple of times he said he saw these shadowy men in the old streets of Bridgeport sort of following him, and they would sometimes look shadowy and insubstantial, and other times more of like a physical form, but they would follow him and intimidate him, and to the point where he got frightened to go out, and then he developed bad stomach issues, which, although he didn't explicitly mention it, kind of sounds like, he developed an ulcer through all this. And he also developed, by his own admission, although it wasn't called that back then, he developed what was clearly obsessive-compulsive disorder, because a couple of times he would go out and he'd come back to home and he'd find things had been subtly moved in his office. And this sort of plunged him into even more paranoia. And because it stressed him out so much, he got into a point where, we realised like a pen had been moved or a notepad, so he would put them back where they were. And because his stress levels increased, he kind of inadvertently developed obsessive-compulsive disorder by having a place for everything, specifically because he wanted to see how easy it was to tell if something had been moved. But the byproduct was that, as I said, he developed OCD, and he did get over all this eventually, but not without getting out the subject and sort of moving on to other things.
Was it Davis Weatherly who tried to make the connection between the black-eyed children and the Men in Black?
Oh yeah, well, actually, there's quite a big connection, or parallels, I should say. David wrote a paper for my Men in Black book on this, all about the black-eyed children angle. Now, the black-eyed children, they're sort of fairly relatively new phenomenon. Now, it only sort of started to surface within the last decade, but a few people have come forward to say, in the light of all the publicity, that they had similar experiences decades ago, but, to what extent we're not sure, because those people didn't come forward until, the sort of more of the modern era, so to speak. But the big parallels are, like the Men in Black, the black-eyed children dress in black almost exclusively. And whereas the Men in Black wear like a black fedora, the black-eyed children wear a black hoodie. So, you've got the hat components as well. And both groups have very pale skin. But most significant of all, I guess, or equally significant if you put all the aspects together, is the fact that they typically turn up at people's homes late at night and knock on the door and come up with excuses to try and get in the house. You know, we're lost, we've lost our parents, we don't know where we are, or we're hungry and we're homeless, can we come in? The whole point is always, can we come in the house? But they have to be invited in, which kind of ties in with like the old vampire legends. And it's kind of the same with the Men in Black. You know, they don't, as some people might imagine, try and force their way into the home. They try and wait, or they do wait for the people to invite them in. Or in some cases, the people felt almost if they've been hypnotized into inviting them in. So you do have sort of 4 or 5 significant parallels there between the Black-Eyed Children and the Men in Black.
I see you were listed as a co-author on David Weatherly's book also. I tried buying a copy, but right now it's going for $169.95 at Amazon.
Well, at Amazon, yeah. Well, actually, I didn't. That's the perfect example of what I mentioned at the beginning. I didn't co-write it. I wrote the foreword for it.
Well,
and that's one of the other issues where it causes a big confusion for a lot of people, because it's clearly, you know, if you read the book or if you open the Kindle version, you know, you can see my name is just listed on the book as doing the introduction or the foreword. And I don't understand why, you know, that happens. But if it's going for that much on Amazon, that's not what David sells. You can get it direct from David at his own website. But unfortunately what happens is that people who've got their own copies and they know what it sells for, you know, they'll just put them on Amazon at ridiculous prices because they've got an Amazon account to sell books, you know. And unfortunately, the person who suffers is the reader, because people just quite rightly shouldn't have to pay that much for anybody's book, you know.
The author also, because...
But David's website, I think it's called Two Crows Paranormal. If you Google that, I think you can buy it direct from David himself.
John Kirk's book has got to have set some kind of a record, though, when it comes to extraordinary prices. I looked it up just 2 days ago. They're still asking $1,316.16 for his paperback. I showed
Is that for his Lake Monsters book?
Yes, the Discovering the Cadborosaurus. I showed it to him on the internet,
wow.
And he jumped up and ran around the room like, holy cow, I wish I could sell it for that.
Ironically, I actually picked up a copy of that, my own copy, in a half-price books shop here in Dallas some time ago for like about $5 or something like that. So.
I paid $12 for mine, so...
Yeah.
It's funny.
Yeah, again, you shouldn't have to pay that sort of price, you know, on Amazon.
Well, they said they can't understand why they haven't sold any copies yet. It's like, well, maybe it's the price. Maybe
that's got something to do with it.
Getting back to the Black-Eyed Kids, I saw an interview with a man who claimed he created the whole thing while sitting in jail. But his story was that he had been interviewed by an author, and he just told him this story about the BEKs as a joke. The last time I checked, they don't allow people into jail just to interview suspects in there. But the guy
I mean, the important thing to note is let's start with the Men in Black stories. Most of the people who have had the Black-Eyed Children experiences have actually spoken on the record. I mean, the first guy who publicly spoke out was actually here in Texas, a journalist. I forget his name now, but you know, you can find his name quite widely, and he really kicked the whole thing off. And he was a well-respected journalist in a Texas town. So it actually began here, you know, right here in the Lone Star State. But as I said, most of the witnesses have spoken out, and that's the case in a lot of the, you know, the ones David spoke about in his book, wrote about in his book. You know, that we're not dealing with Mr. X types or, you know, John Does or anything like that. These are people who anyone can track down by their name and interview for themselves, you know.
Yes. Well, there's always somebody out there who's willing to try and lay the claim for other people's work, it seems.
Well, that always goes on, you know. Somebody wants to be the first with the most or whatever, and but that's, you know, I don't think that's got so much to do always with ufology or anything like that. I think that's just sort of human nature. You know, somebody wants to take credit for inventing this or writing that song, and there's plagiarism. Well, we wrote it before you do, that kind of thing. So.
Well, let's take a real quick break here, 2 minutes, and we'll be right back with Nick Redfern after these messages. You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arcanesa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arcanesa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back. We're speaking with Nick Redfern, author of The Men in Black. I saw a chapter that said there was a incident in 1977 at a Winchell's restaurant in Sunnyvale, California, where 2 teenage girls received a bizarre palm reading from someone. Could you expand on that a bit?
Oh, yeah, that was a very weird story about this guy who, like a lot of the Men in Black, as I said, they're not like the movie versions, Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. And this one was sort of classic example. It was this creepy, old, skinny, cadaverous type guy in the black suit and the fedora driving the black car. And for some reason, they seem to target people specifically, but, not who they know. Very often they'll sort of just approach people and make sort of a threatening statement or, sort of just chill them to the bone. And that's what this guy basically did. He essentially sort of did a fortune-telling situation. And the woman I interviewed for the book said, he told her that she was going to suffer nothing but bad luck and ill health, etc., etc., and which is exactly what happened, just misfortune. And it was a very creepy story that she never sort of forgot and didn't feel that this was sort of a normal human being. There was something very evil about it. It didn't even come across as a regular person. It was, just very, very strange, almost like something straight out of, Edgar Allan Poe meets H.P. Lovecraft rather than The X-Files meets Independence Day, as you might imagine. And that's the case with a lot of these stories that they seem to have, although they're tied to the to the UFO mystery, the Men in Black very much often come across as something definitively, like I said, supernatural, occult, that, have far more in line with sort of a classic Gothic horror story than you would imagine, in today's world.
How about the Hat Man connection with the MIBs?
Well, yeah, that's a good sort of question, because when we look at these stories, we find a lot of parallels. Now, I mentioned about Albert Bender, how a lot of his experiences began with this sort of shadowy experience, where these shadows would appear in the room and then they would sort of take on substance. That actually sounds very much like the phenomenon today, which, as you mentioned, has become known as the shadow people. And they're sort of these shadowy figures that manifest very often in people's bedrooms in the middle of the night, and the person wakes up very often with a sense of paralysis to see this shadowy silhouetted figure standing over them at the side of the bed. They're unable to move. And very often it's wearing a fedora or an old-style hat at least. And there's so many of these reports from not just the US, but all across the planet. And rather bizarrely, this is where it gets really weird, I happen to know the guy who grew up in the house that I grew up in as a little kid, and he had one of these experiences, which was sort of really strange. And so, the shadow people actually sound very much like some of the Men in Black, and particularly with the fedora angle. And there's also like a sub-aspect of the shadow people, a character known as the Hat Man. And a good friend of mine, Heidi Hollis, Heidi, she wrote a book titled The Hat Man, which I'd recommend to anyone who might have had these experiences with these silhouetted shadowy beings in the night. And because it covers literally hundreds of cases and all the various theories that have been put forward to explain the Hat Man. And I think it also ties in, I've got another book coming out in July called Women in Black. Well, the Kindle's actually already out, but the paperback's out in July. And that covers the lesser-known aspect of the Women in Black, which are very similar to the Men in Black. Then, of course, as we said, we've got the Black-Eyed Children. So I think you put all these together, Black-Eyed Children, Men in Black, Women in Black, Shadow People, the Hat Man, the shadow people, the shadow women even. Mm-hmm. And I think you put all this together and we're seeing sort of similar aspects of one larger phenomenon, maybe one that sort of manifests in different ways to different people, but they all have sort of a common denominator to them, I think.
You mentioned sleep paralysis. Do you think that's a real thing or just a made-up medical term that people try to use to explain away a scary situation?
Oh, well, there's no doubt that the phenomenon of sleep paralysis exists. For people who are wondering what it is or may be interested if they don't know, it's basically a case where people typically wake up at night after they've gone to bed, and more often than not, most of the occurrences take place between about 1:30 and 3 a.m. for reasons we don't know, but that is when we're sort of in our deepest sleep state, so that probably has something to do with it at least. You actually don't get that many reports sort of pre-midnight, and there are very few reports sort of 4 to 5 a.m. onwards. It's as I said, it's always sort of 1:30 to 3:30, thereabouts. And people wake up, or they're in a sort of semi-dazed, half-awake state, and they can't move, or they can only semi-move their muscles or their fingers or their hands. And they're in this state of paralysis, and they're also in this state of deep fear because they have this constant feeling that there's something dangerous and malevolent either in the room or moving towards the bedroom, preparing to come inside. And so they're fighting this paralysis. Now, so there's no doubt that the phenomenon exists. The big question is whether it's provoked by internal psychological issues involving the brain, or is it prompted by an external phenomenon that perhaps even kind of attacks us when we're in our sleep state. And my personal view is that it's the latter. And the reason I say that is because I've got a lot of cases where people have had these experiences, the sleep paralysis, and they haven't always been alone, that somebody else has caught a glimpse of them, who happened to wake up, but the person who was targeted couldn't get out of this paralyzed state, but other people saw them. There are examples, where people have seen the sort of the shadow person or the man in black, however you want to describe them, not just in the sleep state. They might have had this paralyzed sleep state one night, thinking it was a dream, and then 3 days later, as they're driving to work, they see this sort of grinning, very often, sort of ghoulish-looking man in black staring at them from the side of the road, which seemingly no one else can see. So, in other words, there is a clear component in a lot of these cases where the person doesn't just experience it in the sleep state. And that, to me, that's a sort of an important factor when we're looking into this angle of, is it all internal or is it external?
In the Pennsylvania case, where there were 3 girls having a sleepover, and a small triangular spaceship of some kind came to the window. Now, this was before this overproduction of drones were flying about. Is that true?
Yeah, that's right. And, I've got a lot of cases like that, where, sleepovers and, sort of in the early hours of the morning. And I think I've got 4 cases in the book. Excuse me. I think I've got 4 cases in the book where they're almost identical cases under very sort of, parallel situations. Dead of night, very often young girls, and sort of predatory character in black. And again, I think it comes down to the likelihood, and Heidi talks about this in her Hatman book, that when we're in a sleep state, we're very vulnerable. And so, in other words, that vulnerability actually perhaps plays into the hands of whatever these entities are and whatever it is they want or need from us. Some people have suggested they sort of feed on like psychic energy, sort of high states of emotion. In other words, they terrorize us and terrify us to then essentially sort of feed on that, the stress chemicals and adrenaline, almost like a psychic vampire. But so many of them involve young girls in the dead of night that there has to be, as far as I'm concerned, some sort of connection here. And as I said, I don't think it's all bad dreams in the slightest. We can go back through time when, these things were called incubus and succubus hundreds and hundreds of years ago. In Newfoundland, for example, they have a story of the old hag, where this form manifests, as the title suggests, in the form of an old hag. But the situation is basically the same. The person's terrified, they're not able to move, and they see this old hag sort of hovering in the doorway or sort of gliding towards the bed.
Well, they said that they hadn't told anyone that they had seen this thing, and yet the men in black were able to show up 2 weeks later. How do you suppose the MIBs knew to show up at that house?
Well, I wish I had the answer to that one, Chris, but the problem is that the men in black, you're quite right, they have this sort of uncanny and eerie knack of being able to know when somebody has seen something, even when they haven't told it, family members or the press or a local UFO group. Nobody knows about it, and yet they still get sort of the late night slow knock on the front door and the threat. There's no real way to have the answer to that, but there are a lot of cases where people have looked into a lot of these weird phenomena, like the Men in Black and Mothman, which is connected to the Men in Black mystery. And it's kind of almost as if when you start looking at the phenomenon, it's almost as if somehow, like, the phenomenon knows about it. It's almost like it gets tipped off like a kind of radar or sixth sense. And John Keel sort of, I guess, summed it up most appropriate of all. He said that when you notice these things, they notice that you notice them, and they kind of turn the tables on you. And I think somehow that ties in with the cases where people have been visited, but they've not told anyone. It's almost as if they got some sort of a unique linkage to the person from the minute that the person sees the UFO or the weird creature or whatever.
Well, Micah Hanks, the radio personality, he runs the Graylian Report. He had a story where he said that someone he knew was told that they have to stop communicating with Micah. Did that person ever speak to Micah Hanks after that?
Well, yes, but I think it was in the context of sort of staying away from all of this. What happened was that Micah, like me, he's got an interest in a lot of different things, and one of them being the Men in Black. And he had this experience where this, again, sort of creepy MIB approached this colleague and friend of Micah and said, you won't talk to Micah Hanks anymore. And this guy was sort of chilled to the bone by it and finally confided in Micah. And it kind of freaked Micah out a little bit as well, that somebody was taking an interest in him and was warning other people to stay away from Micah, And again, you can understand how and why this does create paranoia and concern in some people's minds. It's like, well, what's going on and who are they? And Micah, was absolutely sure that whoever this Man in Black was, that it wasn't sort of a prank. Micah's friend was sort of deeply concerned and worried by this for everybody's sakes, and and that rubbed off on Micah as well.
I can imagine. Now, John Keel accused Gray Baker of writing some of his research letters himself, almost as if he was faking his stories. Why is it, do you suppose, that so many people, not just the UFO community, but Bigfoot, ghosts, all these others, why do they go after each other so darn much?
Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of, petty jealousy and stupidity in these subjects. Don't get me wrong, there's a great deal of dedicated, down-to-earth people. But it's like in many aspects of life, petty jealousies and personality clashes come in, and somebody doesn't like the fact that somebody's written a book on the subject before theirs came out and they were planning theirs. It's just a lot of it comes down to sort of egos and sort of personal agendas. But you get that so much in ufology. I don't really have any time for it, because the way I look at it is that, I kind of take the view we're all in it together. Like, you've got your radio show, Chris. I write books. Somebody else does, a blog. Somebody else lectures. Somebody else got their own TV show. And then we've got the witnesses, who are, the most important people of all, because without the witnesses, we've got nothing to go on. And my view is that what we need to do is just pull together more and share information and get it all out for people to see. And don't sit around complaining and moaning because you were going to do a Loch Ness book and somebody beat you to it by 3 months. Well, big deal, You're a grown-up, you're an adult. Live with it and put your book out as well, and, it adds to what we know. And just because somebody else puts a book out on Loch Ness doesn't mean yours isn't going to sell. If people are interested in the Loch Ness Monster, they're going to buy both books. So it's like, just chill out,
Oh, yeah.
So that's what it comes down to. Keel and Barker did have a clash. And again, one of the reasons was because Keel planned to write the Mothman prophecies, and Barker wrote his own book on Mothman called The Silver Bridge, which was a reference to the Silver Bridge in Point Pleasant, which collapsed, killing dozens of people at the height of the Mothman encounters, and which many researchers felt was connected to the presence of Mothman. So basically, Keel, I have a great deal of respect for Keel, and I love his books, but I think he just didn't like the fact that Barker was putting his own book out, and there would be another rival book on Mothman, and so I think that's what a lot of it is. It's less to do with the subject, and it's more to do with people's egos and personalities, because we're all human at the end of the day. So,
unfortunately, that is the world we live in today. Well, let's take a real quick break. Some commercial messages. We'll be right back in just a minute or two. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Remember, if you're seeking that great cup of coffee, the Organic Man Coffee Shop will be reopening soon. 1002 Eater B Day, Suite number 7. Life is too short to drink bad coffee.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. Welcome back. We're speaking with Nick Redfern again about his book, Men in Black. The giant rock that George Van Tassel was famous for, or was he famous for the rock, or the rock was famous for him? When it split, did anything actually happen afterwards?
Well, I mean, Giant Rock's an interesting area. I've been out there quite a few times over the years, and I wrote a book on the so-called contactee movement, as it's known, which Van Tassel was sort of a prime mover of in the early 50s. Giant Rock is just outside Landers, California, about an hour or so's drive outside of Palm Springs. So it's out in the desert, definitive desert land. And there's this huge rock there, hence the name Giant Rock. And in the early 50s, Van Tassel was an interesting guy. I mean, even before he got involved in the UFO subject, he was actually good friends with the legendary Howard Hughes, and the aviation expert, and as I call him in my book, brilliant fruitcake. And Howard Hughes was sort of one of the most legendary characters of the 20th century, and George Van Tassel worked with him and was good friends with him, and Hughes often came for dinner with Van Tassel and his wife. But what happened in the early 50s was that Van Tassel had these experiences out in the desert at Giant Rock, where he and his wife were living at the time, and he talked about seeing this sort of classic flying saucer land and these very human-looking aliens come out of it with long blonde hair, which they became known as the Space Brothers, and they were sort of the typical types of alien reported in the 50s, the so-called Space Brothers, and as I said, the people who had these experiences were known as contactees, and the message was generally disarm your nukes, live in peace and harmony, or we'll do something about it and intervene. Not unlike the scenario in sort of the Day the Earth Stood Still, the movie, except the fact that in the movie you have Michael Rennie, the actor, in sort of slick black hair and a suit, whereas the Space Brothers are said look more like something straight out of Woodstock in the 60s, sort of like an early sort of hippie movement kind of thing. But Van Tassel developed a massive following, and he used to put these yearly conferences on called the Giant Rock Convention. And at their height, they were getting audiences of like 10,000. People would turn up, and it would be an outdoor event, obviously, for that size. And people just pull up in their cars, bring deck chairs or whatever, and sit and listen to the lectures from people like George Van Tassel, George Adamski, Truman Bethurum, who were all amongst the early contactees. And as I mentioned in my contactees book, there's an extensive FBI file on George Van Tassel showing the FBI was very interested in his claims and his writings. He had this journal, like a newsletter that he would put out regularly, and the FBI had copies of that as well. So, he was someone who was very much sort of a big force in ufology, even though a lot of the early UFO researchers, they wrote off the contactee movement. And I actually don't, because I do think there's something to it. I don't think it was people hoaxing. You can look at the kind of experiences they had in the desert environments, and you find a lot of deep parallels going throughout history where people met supernatural entities in the desert and found their lives changed, and they sort of felt galvanized to become leaders of groups and things. You can take UFOs out of the equation and find very similar things, as I said, throughout recorded history.
The final word in your book, you mentioned the letter from Bender that fell off the wall. Did the letter survive?
The letter survived, but the picture frame didn't.
That was weird.
But that was a weird thing. I mean, I talk about this quite often when, like I said, when you look into these phenomena, it's as if they get their grips into you. And as I mentioned in the Men in Black book, we're talking about last summer now, because it takes a few months to a book to go from being the Word document, obviously, to becoming a finished book. But what happened, it was last summer, and I just finished the Word document for the book, closed it down, I was going to send it to my agent, Lisa, and as I closed it down, I heard a bang coming from somewhere in my apartment. It's not a big apartment, so, it didn't take me long to find it. What had happened is that in one of the rooms, a a picture had fallen off the wall and the frame had broke and the glass had shattered. And that particular room has a lot of paintings and pictures on the wall, as most of the rooms do as well. But of all the pictures that fell off, at the very time as I closed the Men in Black book document, it was a framed letter that Albert Bender, who kicked off the Men in Black mystery, had written to a colleague and friend back in the early 50s, warning him about the Men in Black. And it was sort of like a weird synchronistic event that led me to think that, this wasn't coincidence. It was almost as if, in some, almost like an ethereal, weird fashion, the Men in Black were watching me as well. And I've had a few experiences like that, usually based around synchronicities, that lead me to believe, that somehow this phenomenon does know when you sort of look at it. It sort of looks back at you.
That was a different experience. Aside from the MIBs,
well, yeah, very different.
Aside from the MIBs, you're also interested in cryptozoology. And how did that come about?
Well, that actually goes back to when I was about 6 years old. I went to, my parents took me on a week's holiday to Scotland, spent a day at Loch Ness. And so I got to know the story of the Loch Ness Monster. And but I sort of forgot about it then for a couple of years. And it was when the interest in UFOs reached me when I was sort of 11 or 12, as we mentioned earlier. As I said, I started to read a lot of John Keel's books, and Keel suggested that all these phenomena, whether Bigfoot, lake monsters, UFOs, they all seem to have, there were certain things that interconnected them, and Keel came to believe that in something that he called the cosmic trickster, the idea of one form that can perhaps manifest in different ways, but it's all interconnected, even though we don't think it is. So, reading things that Keel had written about, like Mothman and lake monsters and Bigfoot, then that sort of pushed me down the path of reading about those things. And I guess probably cryptozoology is one of my favourite areas because I enjoy going on sort of expeditions, and looking for these things and staking out lakes and, forests and stuff like that. And, hopefully one day we'll catch or at least find evidence of some of these things. So, I enjoyed the sort of the road trip angle of those sort of investigations.
You're not speaking in Jefferson this year, I see. Will you be making an appearance there, sell some books?
Oh, yeah, I'm having a table there. What usually happens is that... I am giving one lecture there. Yeah, but it probably may not be on the site yet because actually with Craig, the organiser, we only sort of discussed it just very recently, so I will be added to it. But I'll have a table there and I'll be giving a small lecture. But typically what usually happens is that, obviously Craig doesn't just want the same people over and over every year. You want to bring new people in, because the audience wants to see new stuff. So I will actually have a table there selling books, etc. And, I'll be there for the whole weekend because, again, you learn a lot, but it's a good sort of social time as well. And I spoke there last year and I think the year before, so it's definitely time to let other people have a say as well. So.
Yeah, the first time I ran into you was at the Bigfoot conference when it was in Thailand.
Yeah.
I was surprised.
Yeah, that was a long time ago.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. But I like the Bigfoot one because, it is a good social scene and everybody kind of knows everybody after a time and nobody has any sort of worries about sharing their story or being laughed at because most of the people there have either had experiences or they know someone who has, so everybody is sort of in it all together, which is a good thing.
Oh, yes. Anything new with the chupacabras? Not
really. I mean, I did a book on this last year called Chupacabra Road Trip, which sort of covered all my on-the-road expeditions around Puerto Rico looking for the original Chupacabra and, of course, around Texas for the Texan equivalent. But I think the subject's from my perspective, I don't get anywhere near as many reports as I did, say, a year or two ago. Now, people are still seeing them, but I think the media coverage, which was really intense for a while here in Texas, it sort of died off, and I think the spiraling effect is that when the media doesn't talk about it so much, people don't tell them about it so much, and when they don't tell them so much, the media doesn't cover it so much. So it's like a spiraling thing where, unless something really big happens, it sort of gets pushed to the sidelines again.
We were going to have a live studio audience tonight. We're going to take some questions from the audience, but they weren't able to make it. I did get 3 questions from one of the would-have-been participants. She wanted me to ask you, have you ever dreamt that ETs were talking to you?
I actually haven't, but I have had some weird dream-like situations where I did kind of feel like it was almost like a supernatural invasion of your dream, that kind of thing. And that was actually tied in with a sleep paralysis experience I had back in 2002. It was as if it was definitely sleep paralysis, but it felt like something was not just in the room, but it actually invaded my dreams and prevented me from, or tried to prevent me from waking up, because I think it's only in the dream state that they can kind of get their grips into you. So I can't say it was an extraterrestrial. It was actually like a cowled, hooded type figure, which I felt coming down the corridor. This was when I was living in a little town called Needland in South Texas, and I kind of felt this presence of this hooded figure coming down the corridor. I couldn't move. I tried, and I felt it was sort of trying to get into the dream state and keep me there for whatever reason. So that's kind of along those lines, but I can't say, it was an extraterrestrial or what it was.
Mm-hmm. You didn't see any outfit with any strange symbols, anything like that?
No, it was actually like a dark cloak and with like a cowled head, that kind of thing. So there weren't really any patterns or anything. No.
You ever have any dreams that came true?
Oh, yeah. I've had about 3. There was nothing particularly spectacular about them, but I think I've had 3 dreams over the years, which were sort of prophetic dreams of something that happened. And it was, it wasn't anything significant, like a car crash in a specific place or anything. It was just, just run-of-the-mill everyday stuff. But it was the context of it and the specifics were right on target. And, it was sort of maybe a year before I had the dream, and then something happened. Then I realized, wow, that what just happened was sort of, exactly like that dream I had. And for some reason, I remembered the dream. So, I think that's important. It wasn't just like deja vu, where you think you've done something again previously. I was able to have sort of conscious recall, of that dream. I would think about it from time to time, and then it was literally as if, it had come true. So, what that tells me is that, when you have a sort of prophetic dream of something that happens in the future, it suggests to me we don't understand the true nature of reality. We don't understand the concept of time as it actually is. I think time as we see it, is obviously as we see it. But I think sometimes within time itself, there can be glitches, or maybe they're just aspects of it we don't understand. If we did, maybe we could manipulate it and alter it. Maybe that's what some of these entities are. Maybe they're, one of the theories of the Men in Black is that they're time travelers, and, they come back, essentially to threaten us, not to talk about UFOs. Maybe it's something to do, with concerns about timelines being altered, that they threaten us for that reason, and we're not seeing the bigger picture. So.
Well, do you have any new books that you're working on right now, or any new adventures that you're starting out on?
Well, as I said, I've got the Women in Black book. The paperback comes out in July. The Kindle one's already up there. Then in September, I've got actually a book on the Loch Ness Monster, but it deals with a range of bizarre and weird paranormal data attached to Nessie. And I also got that in that same month through Visible Ink Press, a book called The Monster Book, which is an A to Z of 200 weird creatures. So, you've got like B for Bigfoot and N for Nessie, but then there's about 20 or 30 of well-known ones, but then there's about 170 ones that, people I think will find really interesting, but they're sort of very largely unknown, regional ones of just very strange creatures across the U.S. and the rest of the world.
Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating hour. I wish it didn't have to shut it down, but our time has come and gone. I really like to thank you for participating tonight, and I look.
Well, I appreciate you having me on the show, Chris. I had a good time.
I look forward to seeing you in Jefferson. I'll bring my copy of Men in Black and get you to sign it.
Yeah, I'll be pleased to do that for you.
Alrighty, and I'll be speaking to you again shortly. Thank you, sir.
All right, thanks a lot, Chris. Thanks. Bye-bye.
That was Nick Redfern, author of the Men in Black, and his other book, which is coming out shortly, Women in Black. If you'd like to get a copy, go to Amazon.com. If you'd like to have it signed by the author, join us in Jefferson, Texas, October 15th for the Texas Bigfoot Research Society's or Center's convention. This has been Strange Things with Chris James. Hope you all have enjoyed tonight's show. We'll be back next week with another episode. So until then, see y'all later. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, the same murder 3? Strange things that I've been hearing, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?